They said the laughter could be heard before the door even opened. A soft, polished kind of laughter, the kind that floats off marble floors and hangs in the air like perfume. But when the heavy oak doors finally swung wide, that laughter turned sharp. It cut through the silence like glass. Daniel and Maya stood in the doorway of the Langston estate, two names whispered with both admiration and disbelief across Wall Street. A black couple, self-made, standing on the edge of a $30 billion partnership with the richest family in the country. They had been invited for dinner, but from the moment they stepped inside, they could feel it. The quiet arrogance that lived in the air, the eyes that scanned their skin before their handshake. Maya's hands were steady, though her pulse betrayed her calm. Daniel's jaw flexed once, then eased. He smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that had disarmed countless boardrooms. But tonight, it meant something colder than rivalry. It meant mockery disguised as charm. The patriarch of the Langston family, Richard Langston, raised his glass and said, "To new partnerships, to progress." But his eldest son, Lucas, tilted his head, smirking. "Progress," he repeated softly. "Must look different these days." A few guests laughed, too quickly, too loud. Daniel didn't flinch. Maya's gaze didn't fall. Instead, she met Lucas's eyes with the calm of someone who's learned to survive every room designed to humiliate her. Dinner was served beneath chandeliers that looked like they'd been carved from frozen time. The table stretched long, silver-reflecting candlelight like water. Lucas kept speaking. Stories, jokes, all of them circling back to the same poisoned center. He spoke of heritage, of old money, of tradition that can't be bought. And though the words were dressed in velvet, they stung like barbed wire. At one point, he leaned forward and said, "Daniel, how does it feel to be the first in your family to own a suit like that?" Silence fell. The air seemed to pause. Even the chandelier light flickered. Maya looked at her husband, waiting. But Daniel didn't rise. He simply smiled, slow, quiet, dangerous. He set down his wine glass and said, "It feels like history correcting itself." The table stilled. The moment passed. But Maya could feel it, the crack forming in the room's facade. That night, when they left the Langston mansion, the snow had begun to fall. It softened everything. The driveways, the statues, the sharpness of that laughter that still echoed in their ears. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. Maya stared out the window. "Was it worth it?" she whispered. He looked at her, eyes tired but alive. "Ask me when it's done." Because in 48 hours, they were set to sign a deal that would merge their company, a sustainable tech empire built from nothing, with Langston Global Industries. A deal that would make headlines, a deal that would rewrite what power looked like in America. But behind the glimmer of that opportunity, something else was stirring. Something darker. Something that had begun quietly at that dinner table, with a joke, a smirk, and a family who believed they could laugh at anyone and still be untouchable. 2 nights later, Maya received a call from their lawyer. A leaked video was circulating in private circles, one showing Daniel's voice edited to sound arrogant, condescending, ungrateful. "The Langstons had concerns," he said carefully. "They might reconsider." Maya felt her breath leave her chest. She knew what this was. Not a misunderstanding, a move. They wanted to remind them where they stood. That night, Daniel sat on the balcony of their apartment, watching the city lights flicker beneath the winter fog. He said quietly, "They don't see us, Maya. They see what they think we should be." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's show them what we are." But Daniel didn't answer. His silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. Because for years he had learned how to turn humiliation into leverage. Somewhere in that quiet city below, a decision was already forming, one that would change not only their lives, but the legacy of the Langstons forever. And as the snow thickened, the world kept moving, unaware that by morning, the richest family in America would be standing on the edge of the biggest loss they'd ever known. The call came just before dawn, a voice too calm to be innocent. "Mr. Carter, I regret to inform you the Langstons have withdrawn from the merger. No official statement yet, but it's over." Daniel didn't move. He just stared through the window at the city still half asleep, lights blinking like a dying constellation. Maya stood behind him, her robe pulled tight, her face unreadable. "Over?" she whispered. "After everything?" Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the glass. "No, not yet." There was something dangerous in his stillness, the kind of silence that comes before an earthquake. Later that morning, news headlines began to ripple across financial networks. Langston Global reevaluates partnership after cultural concerns. It was a euphemism, a polite disguise for something ugly. Photos of Daniel and Maya appeared beside the Langston sons, cropped and edited to tell a story that wasn't theirs. Investors began calling. Journalists started asking questions. Old interviews were dug up, reinterpreted, twisted into insinuations. Maya watched it unfold like watching a house burn from the inside. Everything they'd built, everything they'd proven reduced to rumor. By noon, Daniel walked into their office, a glass tower overlooking the river. Once alive with ambition, now hushed with uncertainty. Their team stood frozen, staring at screens. Someone whispered, "They're saying you were ungrateful to them, that you mocked the Langstons' tradition." Daniel didn't flinch. He just said softly, "Let them talk." Then, with a quiet finality, he walked into his office and closed the door. Inside, he called no one. He simply opened a folder labeled Langston Dossier. He'd kept it for months, not out of malice, but instinct. A collection of reports, letters, documents quietly shared by people the Langstons had wronged. Factory workers, environmentalists, small business owners. Every page was a story. Every story was a wound. When Maya entered the room, she found him standing by the window again. "You're not thinking—" "I'm done thinking," he interrupted. "They mocked us at their table, Maya, in front of their children, their friends. And now they've called it cultural differences. No, it's not over until they understand the cost of disrespect." Maya looked at him, at the man who had fought his way through decades of walls made of money and prejudice and quiet laughter. "Daniel," she said softly, "if you fight them on their level, you lose even if you win." He turned to her, eyes hollow. "Then maybe it's time they saw what losing really feels like." That night, Daniel sent an email to a journalist he trusted, one who didn't belong to the Langstons' world. Attached were hundreds of pages, evidence of financial manipulation, environmental fraud, offshore accounts linked to political influence. Nothing about revenge, just truth laid bare. 2 days later, the first article dropped. The headline didn't mention Daniel or Maya. It didn't need to. It read, "Langston Global under federal investigation, billions at stake." The story spread like wildfire. Stocks fell. Board members panicked. And in the midst of it all, the public began to ask the question the Langstons had spent generations avoiding. What kind of empire was this family really running? In the quiet chaos of their apartment, Maya read the article over and over. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. Instead, she walked to the balcony where snow still clung to the rails like fragile hope. "Was it worth it?" she asked again. Daniel joined her, his breath visible in the cold air. "They wanted to remind us of our place," he said. "Now they'll remember ours." But even as he said it, something inside him ached. Not triumph, not relief. Just a hollow space where belief used to live. The belief that progress could exist without war. The next morning, another headline appeared, this time on every major network. Langston-Carter merger officially canceled. But beneath it, in smaller letters, Langston, heir under investigation for discriminatory remarks, caught on recording. Someone had leaked the audio from that dinner, the mockery, the laughter, the cruel jokes that had once echoed off marble walls. It was all there, raw and undeniable. The world turned fast. Sponsors withdrew. Activists demanded accountability. For the first time, the Langstons' laughter was silent, and yet Daniel felt no victory in it, because beneath every headline, every exposed lie was a deeper truth, that he and Maya hadn't fought for revenge. They'd fought to be seen, but the world rarely changes quietly. That evening, as rain began to melt the last of the snow, Daniel walked alone through the city, past neon lights reflecting off puddles, past strangers who didn't know his name but somehow knew his story. He stopped by a cafe window, watching people laugh inside, free, unguarded, human. He thought about how easily dignity is mistaken for defiance, how the world demands grace from those it refuses to respect. When he returned home, Maya was waiting at the kitchen table, her eyes tired but steady. "They'll come after us now," she said. "I know. They'll try to bury the truth." "They can try," he said, sitting down beside her. "But truth doesn't die. It just waits." The rain thickened, drumming against the glass. In that small sound there was something almost holy, like the earth itself washing away what was left of shame. And somewhere, across the city, the Langstons sat in a boardroom stripped of power and illusion, staring at the very people they once mocked, now the reason their empire was crumbling. Yet for Daniel and Maya, the real storm hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The city had stopped whispering and started watching. Every network, every investor, every late-night show spoke the Langstons' name like a warning. What had been laughter turned to silence. What had been power turned to panic. But inside Daniel and Maya's apartment, quiet ruled. The kind of quiet that hums after the storm, heavy, uncertain, waiting. For days, neither of them spoke much. Their phones buzzed constantly. Offers for interviews, statements, opinions. Some wanted to praise them, others to corner them, a few to destroy them. But they stayed silent. Then one morning, the knock came. It wasn't a journalist. It wasn't an ally. It was Richard Langston himself. He stood in the hallway, older, smaller somehow, his pride dimmed like a flame running out of air. His voice, once grand, was almost human now. "May I come in?" Maya looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded once and stepped aside. Richard entered like a man walking into his own confession. He looked around. No marble, no chandeliers, just the warm hum of a life built from sweat and stubbornness. "This is simpler than I imagined," he said quietly. Maya's voice was calm. "That's because we earned it." He looked down, ashamed. "I suppose you did." There was a pause, long enough for memory to surface. The dinner, the laughter, the humiliation. Then Richard said softly, "You know, my son has disappeared from the public eye. The board is in chaos. Our name, it's ashes." Daniel met his gaze. "And you came here for what? Sympathy?" Richard's eyes lifted, tired but clear. "No, to say you were right. I raised a family that thought wealth could buy dignity. I taught them wrong. I wanted to tell you that." Maya studied him, the tremor in his voice, the weight behind his words. "And what does that change?" she asked. He hesitated. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his voice low. "You mocked us, Richard." "Not just that night. Your whole world did. You wanted to remind us that we didn't belong at your table." Richard nodded slowly. "And you reminded me that no one owns the table." Silence again. But this time it wasn't cold. It was almost reflective. Richard reached into his coat pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. "This is what remains of the partnership fund. The lawyers said to reclaim it. But I don't want it. You built something honest. Take it. Use it to build something greater. Not with us." "Without us." Maya stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Money can't clean what pride destroyed." Richard nodded again, his eyes glistening. "Then let it be a start." He stood, his breath shallow, and turned toward the door. But before he left, he said one last thing, so quiet it nearly dissolved into the air. "My wife used to say true wealth isn't inherited. It's borrowed from those who come after you." I forgot that until now. When the door closed, the apartment felt lighter, not because forgiveness had been given, but because truth had finally been spoken. Maya sank into the chair, her hands trembling slightly. "Do you believe him?" Daniel sighed. "I believe he's human. That's a start." They didn't open the envelope that night. They let it sit there, untouched, like a question waiting for its answer. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world smelled of clean air and possibility. And for the first time in weeks, Maya smiled. Small, quiet, real. The next morning, Daniel woke early. He stood on the balcony again, watching the sunrise stretch across the city. He thought of every room that had tried to shrink him. Every conversation that began with doubt and ended in patronizing praise. Every door he'd knocked on that opened only halfway, and then he thought of her, Maya, the anchor that kept him from becoming the very thing he fought against. She joined him, a mug of coffee in her hand, her hair still messy from sleep. "You're thinking again," she teased gently. He chuckled. "Maybe too much." "Good. That means you're healing." He looked at her, the softness in her face, the strength beneath it. "What if we build something new?" he asked. "A fund. For entrepreneurs who've been told no too many times. For every voice that's been laughed at like ours." Maya smiled. "A legacy that doesn't need permission." He nodded. "Exactly." By afternoon, Daniel made the calls. Within weeks, their idea had a name, the ARC Initiative, a symbol of rebuilding, of bending what was broken toward justice. Investors who had once turned away now called back, eager to be part of something clean. But this time, Daniel and Maya were careful. They would never sell ownership of their values again. Months passed. The Langstons faded from headlines. Their empire fractured, quietly sold off piece by piece. But in one small press release, buried in a business section no one read carefully, a new foundation was listed, funded anonymously by Richard Langston himself. Its first donation? To the ARC Initiative. When Maya found out, she didn't tell Daniel immediately. She waited until the night of the gala, the first celebration of their new foundation. The hall was filled with faces that once never had a place in such rooms. Creators, dreamers, fighters. People who wore their scars like proof they'd lived. She leaned close to Daniel and whispered, "Guess who just became one of our donors?" He looked at her, puzzled. She smiled. "A man learning how to start over." Daniel didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Some stories don't end with triumph. They end with transformation. Later that night, as he stood on stage addressing the crowd, he said only this: "There will always be people who think your worth is negotiable, that your voice is a courtesy, not a right. But if you stand long enough, speak truth long enough, love deeply enough, eventually even the powerful have to listen." The crowd rose in quiet applause. Not the thunder of spectacle, but the sound of respect. The sound Daniel and Maya had waited their whole lives to hear. And as the lights dimmed, Maya reached for his hand. He squeezed it gently, his eyes meeting hers. No words, no revenge, just peace. The kind that grows from soil once scorched, now blooming again. Outside, the rain returned, soft and forgiving. And in that rhythm, the world seemed to whisper what Daniel had always believed, but had never dared to say aloud. They hadn't lost a deal. They had reclaimed their dignity. Within months, the ARC Initiative became more than an idea. It became a quiet revolution. What began as a fund for underrepresented innovators turned into a movement of trust, a reminder that dignity could be turned into capital, that power could be redefined. Daniel spent his days meeting founders who reminded him of himself, young, hungry, exhausted, but still burning with belief. They came from small towns and crowded cities, from places where dreams often died of neglect. And when they spoke, Daniel didn't just hear ambition. He heard echoes of every room he'd been told he didn't belong in. Maya watched him closely, proud but wary. She'd seen what battles could do to the soul, the sleepless nights, the headlines that blurred truth with spectacle. But Daniel was different now, not hardened, just clearer. Like fire that had learned how to light without consuming. One evening, after a long board meeting, Maya received a letter. No email header, no logo. Just a cream envelope hand-delivered. Inside was a single line written in trembling ink. "Thank you for showing my grandchildren who I could have been." It was signed, Richard Langston. Maya sat for a long time staring at that letter. Not because it changed the past, but because it proved people could change. When Daniel came home, she handed it to him without a word. He read it once, then again, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer beside their marriage photo. A quiet acknowledgement that even the cruel can find redemption, if they're brave enough to face what they've broken. Weeks later, the ARC Initiative hosted its first mentorship summit. Dozens of creators gathered under one roof, poets, engineers, educators, all driven by something raw and beautiful. During the opening ceremony, Daniel stood before them, his voice steady but soft. Every empire that mocked the powerless, he said, was built on the illusion that empathy is weakness. But empathy is a mirror. One day, the world will have to look into it. Applause rippled through the hall, slow, real, human. Not the sound of victory, but of awakening. After the summit, Maya found Daniel sitting alone backstage, staring at a single spotlight still glowing above the empty stage. She sat beside him. "You still don't rest," she said. He smiled faintly. "Rest is for when the story ends." "Maybe," she whispered. "The story doesn't need to end. Maybe it just needs to be lived." That night they walked home through the city, past murals of color and laughter, past strangers who nodded in recognition. For the first time in years, Daniel felt invisible in the best way. Not as someone being judged, but as part of something larger, collective, alive. In the months that followed, one story began circulating quietly through business circles. Investors whispered about it in private dinners, how the Carters had canceled a $30 billion deal and somehow still won. Some called it strategy, others called it stubbornness. But those who looked closer knew it wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming worth. The Langston name, meanwhile, was no longer gilded with fear. Their heirs began speaking publicly about rebuilding transparency, acknowledging the arrogance of the past. Richard retired quietly, his final public statement a single line. "We cannot inherit grace. We must earn it from those we wrong." It was the first time in his life the world applauded him not for his wealth, but for his humility. Years passed. The ARC Initiative became global. Schools named scholarships after Daniel and Maya. Documentaries were made, though neither of them agreed to appear. They wanted the story to belong to others now, to every voice once silenced by rooms that laughed instead of listened. One autumn evening, Daniel and Maya visited a small school funded by their foundation. The walls were covered with drawings, hands of every shade holding each other. Children ran through the halls with laughter that didn't echo with cruelty, but with joy. As they left, one little girl tugged at Maya's sleeve. "Miss," she said shyly, "is it true you said no to rich people?" Maya smiled. "Yes," the girl tilted her head. "Were you scared?" Maya knelt, her eyes kind. "A little, but sometimes courage isn't about not being scared. It's about choosing who deserves your yes." The child nodded, thinking hard, then ran off to play. Outside, the sky was painted in copper light. Daniel watched her run, then turned to Maya. "That's it, isn't it?" he murmured. "That's the legacy." She smiled, looping her arm through his. "Not the money. The permission to believe." They walked home in silence, their footsteps soft against the fading day. Later that night, Daniel opened the old drawer. Inside, the Langston letter, untouched. He read it one last time, then whispered, "I forgive you." He didn't know if forgiveness traveled through time or found its way to the dead, but somehow, the room felt lighter. The past had finally exhaled. Outside, rain began again, not the cold kind that punishes, but the kind that renews. It tapped softly on the glass, as if reminding them that every storm eventually turns to water, and every wound, if left open to light, learns how to heal. And so, The laughter that once mocked them became an echo in history, a relic of ignorance. What remained was something far greater, a love that refused to bow and a truth that refused to die. Years passed like slow thunder. The world moved on, yet some stories refused to fade. They lingered, whispered, retold by those who found courage in their echoes. Daniel and Maya's names had become something more than people. They were symbols of grace, defiance, and the quiet revolution of dignity. A decade after the night that changed everything, the ARC initiative stood taller than ever, its programs stretching from cities to villages, from crowded classrooms to forgotten neighborhoods. And on the anniversary of its founding, a gala was held, not for wealth, but for remembrance. The hall was filled with faces Daniel and Maya had once only dreamed of seeing together, people of every shade, every story, every struggle, dressed not in power but in purpose. At the center stood a stage with two portraits side by side, Daniel's calm intensity and Maya's unwavering eyes. Because now, it was Maya alone who stood before the crowd. Daniel had passed 3 months earlier, quietly at home, his last moments spent watching the sunrise with her. He hadn't spoken much that morning, just smiled and said, "If I leave before you do, promise me you'll keep building light." Then he'd closed his eyes as the sun poured gold across his face. Tonight, as the hall dimmed and Maya stepped forward, the air trembled with memory. She spoke softly, her voice fragile but filled with strength. "Daniel once told me that truth doesn't shout, it waits. That one day the world would have to listen. And tonight I think it finally has." The crowd rose, not in applause, but in silence, a reverent stillness that felt sacred. She continued, her voice breaking slightly. "When we walked into that mansion years ago, we were not fighting for money or status. We were fighting for space, the right to exist without apology. And we learned something. Real power isn't measured in billions. It's measured in who you lift when no one's watching." Her hand trembled, and she smiled through the tears. Daniel believed that every person is born with a story the world tries to erase. But if you tell it loud enough, not in anger, but in truth, you give others permission to write their own. The lights above her softened, and for a moment, it felt as though the air itself leaned closer. In the front row sat Richard Langston's grandchildren, young adults now, carrying a name once burdened by arrogance. They had become allies of the ARC, advocates for justice and reform. When the eldest rose to speak, his voice shook with emotion. "My grandfather once told me that a man's worth is not what he keeps, but what he repairs. He wanted you to know, Mrs. Carter. He never stopped trying to repair." Maya closed her eyes, tears finally escaping. Then he did what mattered most. After the gala, she stepped outside. The night air was cool, the city alive with light and distant music. She walked alone for a while, down to the river where she and Daniel had once dreamed out loud about the future. The water shimmered, carrying reflections like memories, restless, beautiful, eternal. She whispered his name, and it felt like the breeze answered. From her pocket, she pulled a folded piece of paper, the Langston letter. It was worn now, the ink faded. She looked at it one last time, then let it slip into the water. It drifted away slowly, carried by a current older than any empire. "Rest easy, my love," she said softly. "You turned pain into purpose." The wind lifted around her, warm and alive. She smiled through it, not because grief was gone, but because love had outlasted it. Years later, a statue stood outside the ARC headquarters, not of Daniel or Maya alone, but of two hands reaching toward each other, one carved from dark stone, the other from pale marble, joined at the fingertips. Beneath it, the inscription read, "Power is nothing without grace. And grace is everything we leave behind." Every morning, children walked past it on their way to school. Some touched the hands for luck. Some just stared at it, trying to understand the story it told. And somewhere beyond the noise of the city, where laughter once cut like glass and pride once blinded the powerful, a new kind of laughter was born, free, kind, and human, because in the end, Daniel and Maya didn't cancel a deal. They rewrote a legacy, and the world, for once, listened.